Usually on these videos, I like to talk about questions that come up during Q&A, but not every interesting conversation is had during Q&A. Sometimes the most interesting conversations are had after Q&A, when we stay behind and people come up and talk to you. And one of the objections that I hear a lot from well-meaning people who disagree with me, and obviously curious because they've come up and gracious enough to have a conversation with me, is even after all of our discussion, they look me in the eye and they say, I just don't believe that the fetus is like us. Now, why is this most interesting that it's happening after the presentation? Because during the presentation, we've already addressed the idea that oftentimes people make a category mistake when they're discussing abortion. They take what is an objective moral claim and they drop it into the realm of a preference claim. What they say are things like, if you don't like abortion, then don't have one, at which time I inform them, I never said I didn't like abortion. I don't like Pepsi. I love Coke. I don't like Red Delicious apples. I like Granny Smith apples. Those are preferences that I have. And as soon as I say I like or don't like, I take whatever it is I'm arguing it, I drop it into the realm of preference. These aren't propositions that can be evaluated as truth claims. You just have to take my word for it when I tell you what I like or don't like. And that's a different kind of statement than saying that abortion unjustly takes the life of an innocent human being. See, that is a proposition that we can evaluate as a truth claim. Does abortion end a human life, first of all? Well, it seems inarguably that we have a human life present and that abortion destroys it. Now, some people may say that it's not a human life yet, but this goes against science. Steve Jacobs, who just finished his PhD at University of Chicago, as part of his PhD thesis, sent out a questionnaire to thousands of academic biologists, professional biologists, asking the question, when does a mammal's life begin? And over 5,000 replied. Over 5,000 academic professional biologists replied. The overwhelming, almost all of them were PhDs, by the way, and they all affirmed, or 96% of them affirmed that human life begins, that a mammal's life begins at fertilization. So science tells us that life begins at fertilization. So a human life ends during the process of abortion. The question is it the kind of human life that we have some obligation or duty to respect? That's not a scientific question. That is a philosophical question. And we argue that the best explanation for our shared intuitions that all human life should be treated with dignity and respect, or that we have some common universally held dignity, that it's wrong to treat an American or an Iranian or an Englishman or people all over the globe in China, it's wrong to treat them unjustly, no matter where they live, no matter what kind of regime they live under, whether it's a communist regime or whether it's a Muslim regime that is following Sharia law, or whether it's the United States and a capitalist system, a republic. No matter what system you live under, there are certain things that it's wrong to do to other human beings. And the best explanation for that is that what grounds our value is our shared humanity. It's the only thing that we all have equally. So with these kind of arguments, we can evaluate the claim that abortion unjustly takes the life of an innocent human being for its truth, for its content, as opposed to saying I like or don't like things. I don't say I don't like abortion. I argue abortion is wrong. But I've already pointed that out, and they already heard this in the presentation. So either it's not coming home for them, or they think they mean something different when they tell me their heartfelt belief that the fetus just isn't like us. Now here it's important, I think, to use what Greg Koukl in his Tactics book use those kind of questions that draw people out. In Greg Koukl's book, Tactics, he talks about asking, what do you mean by that? And so the first question I ask, after we've had this conversation and they want to end it there, is I say, wait, would you be willing to humor just a little bit more in this conversation? And if they graciously accept that, I say, let me ask you a question. What do you mean when you say you don't believe that? Because there's a couple of different things that they could mean that doesn't actually fall into the category maybe of making that preference mistake versus an objective moral claim. What I ask is, what do you mean by that? And oftentimes what they tell me is that they're just not convinced. And that's different than when I say I believe that the unborn are not like us, I believe that the fetus is not like us, that in logic is what we call a self-report. It can't be evaluated. But if they say, I'm just not convinced, that's different. And then the next question I ask, I also get from Greg Koukl, where he said, ask them, do you consider yourself to be open-minded? And if so, and if what you're saying is, I can't be convinced, or are you saying that there could be evidence that would convince me? And so I ask them, what evidence would convince you that the unborn were like us? What arguments? What do you need to see? Now, this is an important question. To give you an example, when I was an atheist, when I was younger, there was a young Christian woman in college that was talking to me, and she asked me that question. She said, what would it take, Jay, for you to change your mind about whether or not God exists? And my answer, to my embarrassment and shame, this is not embarrassing to me, this is just me. I had, and still have, by the way, a stuffed animal, a stuffed Mickey Mouse that I bought, I think my senior year of high school. And that Mickey Mouse would be over 6 feet tall if he were standing up. He's sitting down. At that time, he was sitting in the corner of my apartment. And I looked at that young lady and I said, what I would need to believe that God exists is for that Mickey Mouse over there in the corner to turn his head, look at me, and say, hey, Jay, God is there. And if your God is all-powerful, that shouldn't be a problem. Now, why do I say that's kind of embarrassing for me? Because what did I actually tell that young woman? I can't be convinced by a reasonable discussion. I'm not really open to this discussion. If that's the burden of proof I have placed on it, then all of this discussion and all of this arguing is really just a waste of time. And that's important information to have, because that young lady did more work by stopping at that point and no longer arguing with me once I had shown that my burden of proof was too high for her to ever meet. And then from that point on, what she did was she prayed for me. That's real work that can be done. It really did have end results that were good. I believe that that was part of what ultimately led to me becoming a Christian, was that she was a great arguer. And once she realized that I had set too high a burden of proof, she didn't continue to hammer her points home. She backed off. Now, an interesting add to that was that shortly after I became a Christian, a friend of mine and I were talking, and I remembered that conversation, and I said, let me get in touch with her so that she can find out that I have changed my mind on this. And the very first thing she said when she and I sat down to have lunch together was, so, what did Mickey say? She remembered. She was smart, and she played it the proper way. She dealt with me in the way that I should have been dealt with. But what if they don't mean that there's some evidence lacking for them? And what if they don't have a burden of proof that can be met? What if when I ask them, what do you mean by that, I realize that they're still having trouble understanding this as an objective moral claim, and that there's something personally holding them back? And one of the things I've experienced most in these conversations as holding them back is not that when they say, I don't believe that the fetus is like us, that they mean I'm not yet convinced by the amount of evidence that you've offered me. But what they mean is, I don't want to believe that. I don't want that to be true. One young lady that I was talking to at a college, so bright, so interesting, so open, so willing to talk. She and I had a long conversation, but she just couldn't connect the dots. And so finally, as she said that, I don't believe it, and I asked for more clarification, it became clear that there was something else blocking her. And she finally said, last week, I took my friend to get an abortion. That was all she said, but that was all that I needed to hear. You see, what I knew from that was when she said, I don't believe that the fetus is like us, what she meant was, I don't want to believe it. Why? Because her friend got an abortion, and her friend's not a bad person. Not some evil thing that's out there doing terrible things. Dear friends of mine, people that I love, have had abortions. And it's not lost on me that when I make these arguments, that I'm making the argument that they have done something gravely wrong. They have committed a terrible, as Christians, we would say they've committed a terrible sin. And they have done something for which they will, if they ever change their mind on this, deeply regret. Or maybe some of them actually do still regret it, or actually are actively regretting it now, even though they don't claim to believe the things that I've argued. See, this is a different place. Because when either you have a history with abortion or someone that you love has a history of abortion, you may hear the arguments that we're making as an attempt to say or to characterize somebody who's had an abortion as a terrible person. And so the thing that blocks you isn't that you haven't been convinced by the arguments, but that if the arguments were true, they would mean that the people who have done these things are terrible people, and you know them, and they're not. They can be motivated by all kinds of things. They could have been terribly afraid. They could have been ambitious and just had some future that they wanted to pursue. They could have been under tremendous pressure from some man in their life, either a father or a boyfriend or a husband that was telling them, not this time, I just don't want this child. They may have been callous. They may have been hard-hearted. We don't know. We have no idea why, the motivations why different people are getting them. So this argument is not to look in the past and say that person is bad and reevaluate that person. This argument is about the moral nature of an action that's happening today and tomorrow, and what is the best way to get to a just society. Can we correct this path and get ourselves in a place where we treat all human beings with dignity and respect? To remove it from judgment, I just said this last night, or not last night, 2 nights ago, I was talking to a gentleman who was sharing with me some things about his life, and some people have done things in his past, and why advocating to end abortion, he feared was hurting someone else. And he said, how do I move forward? And I said, well, you can go to them and have a conversation where you say, I'm going to advocate to end abortion because it is my deeply held conviction that the best evidence tells us that the unborn are fully human and due the same basic dignity and respect that all humans are due. And so I can't hold back. But at the same time, I need you to know that I don't love you any less for the things that have happened in the past, and that all of this is not meant to be aimed at you or the things that you have done, because the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ is sufficient for the forgiveness of all sins. And I, just like everyone else, carry my own sin burden, except that Christ has lifted it from me. And so I don't look to condemn or convict. Condemnation and conviction are of others. What I look to do is to see the path forward that draws us closest to the person of Jesus Christ. So to look at them and tell them that my advocacy is not about what you've done in your past, but what we will collectively do in our future. So when somebody says to me, I just don't believe that they're human, that's not the end of it. That's the beginning of another part of the conversation. And there we have to ask clarifying questions. And what I want to encourage most is that when you have someone in front of you that's struggling to connect the dots, or if they keep seemingly returning, like in this particular case, returning to an objection that's already been dealt with, maybe feeling like they're going back to preference claims versus objective moral claims. Maybe going back to confusing this as a Coke versus Pepsi problem as opposed to something more like rape or child abuse or things that we uncontroversially accept are morally wrong, and that we would never see the kind of thing where you could say, do this if you want to, or don't do that if we want to. All people should never do that, and we fully understand that. Maybe take a moment and instead of fighting our way out of it, teach our way out of it. Not in a condescending way that makes them feel like you think they're stupid, but in a respectful way where we recognize that every conversation is an opportunity to share our worldview and contrast the 2 different ways that we're seeing human value, the 2 different ways that we're seeing human beings, and maybe the 2 different ways that we understand what humanity within our worldview is. And here we have the opportunity to say that this way, as near as we can argue and present, is a better way to answer those questions. Not subjectively, not saying that I just believe these things, but by arguing that the best evidence tells us that they're human from the moment they come into existence, and the best explanation for our shared intuitions of universal human dignity is that what makes us valuable, each and every one of us, is our shared humanity, is the only thing that we share equally among us all. And so when they say things like, I just don't believe it, help them to understand, that's a self-report. When you say you don't believe it, you're not saying anything about the fetus. You're not saying anything about the embryo. You're not saying anything about the unborn. You're saying something about you. So what do you mean when you say you don't believe it? Do you mean you're not convinced? Or do you mean that because of something that you or someone else has done, you just don't want to believe it? Because we have to deal with these objections differently. This is Jay Watts with Merely Human Ministries. Thank you for your time.